Hello and welcome back to TVP World. My name is Alex Tomlinski and these are World Talks. The Armenian Prime Minister has hosted the Iranian president and discussed a number of issues aimed at consistent development of Armenia-Iran relations. And all this following the historic peace agreement brokered between Armenia and Azerbaijan by the United States. Now, part of that agreement includes granting the U.S. exclusive rights to develop the Zangezur corridor for the next 99 years, aimed to connect the Nakhchiavian Autonomous Republic to the rest of Azerbaijan without checkpoints through Armenia. And joining us to discuss this further this morning is Richard Giragosian, the founding director, Regional Studies Center. Good morning and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks, Alex.
So the Armenian Prime Minister told the Iranian president at that meeting that they had that this planned corridor, which will link Azerbaijan with its exclave, will be under Armenian control. And that is days after Iran said it would block this project. Why do you think the Prime Minister emphasized that this corridor will indeed be under Armenian control?
Well, the Armenian Prime Minister was actually very effective in clarifying that Iranian concerns are no longer warranted. In other words, the Iranian president on his way to Armenia was greatly worried that the Washington agreement over transport and road and rail links would either threaten or undermine Iran's border with Armenia. However, the Prime Minister elaborated and clarified that that's not the case. This is no longer a corridor, merely a road and rail connection that will not damage or threaten Iran's border with Armenia. And this is important because Armenia is the only stable, friendly neighbor Iran has.
Now, based on what you just said, so I understand that it's not a corridor, but more like you said, a rail link here, and Iran has, well, nothing to worry about in terms of threatening or undermining its border with Armenia. But do you think, is it only Iran that was voicing, let's say, concerns, or is it possible that maybe it was Russia through Iran, which is maybe worried about its influence in the region?
That's a good question, Alex. What we see is not just the visit of the Iranian president, but the arrival in Armenia of the Russian deputy prime minister. And in fact, it was Russia that was more concerned about any potential American presence and also a little bit worried. However, perhaps reflecting U.S.-Russian relations and the recent meeting in Alaska between the American and Russian presidents, the Russian prime minister publicly endorsed this agreement and actually doesn't necessarily weaken Russia's leverage, but it does frame this new post-war context in a very new light.
So now let's talk a little bit about this new light, because my next question is, what does the U.S. involvement in the region, and of course through these development rights, but also brokering this, I was going to say corridor, but now I'll call it what you just called it, this railroad link, right? What does it signal about the U.S.'s influence in the South Caucasus?
Well, let's be honest. The Trump administration has become very, very good at being very, very bad at consistency and predictable policies. And in this regard, there's a degree of skepticism over the sustainability of American commitment or interest in the region. The EU is a much more effective and much more present player. Nevertheless, the Americans did succeed in not mediating, but actually hosting a bilateral agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And they deserve the credit. However, going forward, I do think that it's going to be European Union investment and engagement that really is much more important than the Trump administration's rather naive approach.
So now you mentioned EU investment here in this regard. I wanted to ask, what safeguards or other cooperative mechanisms might reinforce this peace deal that has been brokered?
Well, first, we already have the presence of an EU monitoring mission in Armenia, guaranteeing border security and actually playing an important third-party role to monitor the situation. A second important element of this is the implementation rather than the conclusion of a bilateral peace treaty. And this is where there's genuine concern. The peace treaty that was also reached related to this rail and road transport agreement was almost dangerously based on a premise of Azerbaijan's use of force and the absence of any international guarantee or guarantor. So I do think Western engagement in general is going to be crucial. But the real wild card here is how Russia reacts and responds.
Now, let's for a second go back to Iran and Armenia. In what ways do you think this rail and road transport agreement will enhance economic ties between both countries, Iran and Armenia?
Well, to be provocative, I don't think it's going to have much of an impact, for the simple reason that the road and rail link brings in Turkey as a regional player and does little to enhance Iranian presence or position in the region. But I do think Iran remains distracted by its own weakness after the attacks by the Israelis, the Americans, the loss of its proxies in the Middle East. And I do think Iran will continue to neglect its traditional regional role. So I think we should look to Turkey and to see what its role will be, much more than Iran.
Now, I know you've mentioned this a little, but do you maybe foresee any tensions, and that is, of course, particularly with Iran, when it comes to the implementation of the security in Armenia, and what might be some potential flashpoints?
Well, to expect tension is just a reflection of the reality. But the tension is not between Armenia and Iran. It's actually Armenia's neighbor, Azerbaijan, and Iran, which has a longer history of tense relations. But the real flashpoint to watch is the Azerbaijani escalation of tension with Iran. And that's largely driven by Azerbaijan's close partnership with Israel and the personal relationship between the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Azerbaijani President Aliyev. And unfortunately, given the volatility, I think that does little to reassure of a post-war stability in this region.
And what about, you also mentioned Turkey earlier. You've mentioned the close relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan. So now, how does Turkey play into all of this, and what kind of role can it play going forward?
Well, what we see, one direct result from this road and rail agreement that was reached in Washington between Armenia and Azerbaijan, is now Turkey is in a position of being unable, if not unwilling, to keep the border with Armenia closed. In other words, Turkey now has a unique opportunity to fulfill a long-standing policy to normalize relations between Armenia and Turkey and to reopen the border. I also think for Turkey, it's in its interest to regain a regional role that it's rather lost as Russia has been increasingly active in the past 5 to 6 years. But I do think the outlook for Turkey-Armenia normalization is a rare positive game changer here.
And I just wanted to ask, because Turkey, I mean, it's also been quite vocal when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, and now we see its role here. I mean, in general, how would you characterize Turkey when it comes to, its foreign policy and, well, the role it's trying to play both in resolving the Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine, but also in this particular region that we're talking about today?
Well, I would say Turkey's position is largely one of weakness rather than strength, and rather of insecurity over confidence, largely because Turkey has been trying to play all sides after Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. It's also become prisoner to its relationship with Azerbaijan, limiting its. However, the one major success in Turkish foreign policy was the situation in Syria, the collapse of the Assad regime. Turkey is now much more eager to a larger role, both in terms of Central Asia, South Caucasus, and it is only hindered by domestic problems in terms of authoritarian governance and setbacks to both Turkey's relationship with the West and also challenges regarding incomplete democracy in Turkey.
And now let's for a second go back to Iran real quick. I still wanted to ask, because the Iranian president, after visiting Armenia, he traveled to Minsk, to Belarus. How do you read Iran's goal, to strengthen its relationship between, of course, itself and Belarus?
Well, Iran is greatly weakened, and like President Putin's Russia, has been very good at losing partners and making enemies. The trip to Belarus after Armenia is a rare example of a welcome destination for the Iranian leadership. But to be fair, however, there is a very interesting divide or divergence in Iran, where the civilians, the president, the foreign minister, much more forward-looking, and they want to de-escalate, whereas the Revolutionary Guards and the Ayatollah are much more hard-lined and still militant. But I do think Iran, like President Putin, have become isolated in terms of geopolitics and diplomacy.
All right. Well, thank you so much for breaking it all down for us, the region, but also looking at it, in this global perspective. Richard Giragosian, founding director from the Regional Studies Center, thank you so much for joining us here this morning on TVP World.
Thanks, Alex.
And with that, it's a wrap for this edition of World Talks. But as always, you want to stay tuned to TVP World for more breaking news, updates, and commentary. See you soon.